Hello, I'm Lucy Byrne, Manager of Assessment at the Australia Council for the Arts. I'm a 50-year-old woman with dark brown hair. I wear glasses, and today I'm wearing a green shirt. Thank you for watching this webinar. We hope this discussion will help everyone to feel more confident using the First Nations protocols when they assess applications. For those of us viewing this webinar from Australia, I would like to acknowledge we are on Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to my First Nations colleagues on this panel and any First Nations peoples watching this webinar. Some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded on the 28th of February, 2023, and is available on our website. The session is being Auslan interpreted by Alyssa and Isabella. Thank you both. The webinar runs for approximately 45 minutes. If you have any questions after the webinar, you can contact us directly. And now some introductions. I'm going to ask our panel to switch on their cameras and I will introduce them, each of them in turn. As I do so, could each of you say hello and let us know where you are dialing in from and provide an audio description of yourself. I am in the offices at the Australia Council for the Arts on Gadigal country. With us today, we have Patricia Adjei. Patricia is a Budathi Mabiog Islander and Ghanaian woman from Sydney, Australia. Patricia has a Bachelor of Arts and Law from the University of New South Wales. She currently works at the Australia Council for the Arts as Head of First Nations in the Sector Development Division. Patricia previously worked at the copyright agency VizCopy as the Indigenous Engagement Manager. She is also a 2018 Churchill Fellowship recipient. Her fellowship research investigated the practical application of laws in the USA and Panama that protect Indigenous cultural rights.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lucy, for that introduction. I'm actually dialing in from outside of Australia this morning, or this evening for you, from Geneva, Switzerland. I'm here attending an international meeting around the protection of Indigenous culture and art and knowledge. But I have, I'm in my 40s, I have black hair, brown round face, and I'm wearing a navy blue dress with white spots.
Thanks very much, Trish. Another colleague joining us from the Australia Council today is Jake Smithers. Jake is a Kamilaroi man from northern New South Wales. Jake is an Artist Services Officer. Jake's role is to manage the relationship with applicants to the Australia Council's Arts Project Investment Programs. Artist Services Officers provide support to applicants in a variety of ways, including advice as to which funding opportunity best fits their proposal, as well as a general appraisal of applications. Jake's art speciality is music and First Nations arts and culture.
Thanks, Lucy. Hi, everyone. My name's Jake and I'm dialing in from Gadigal land here in Redfern. I'm a man in my 30s. I have brown hair, brown eyes, and today I'm wearing a purple shirt.
Thank you, Jake. I'm also excited to introduce our two special guests on the panel. Firstly, Dr. Paula Abood. Paula is a writer, educator, and creative producer. Paula has worked with diverse groups and communities, including women and children from refugee and asylum-seeking backgrounds for over 3 decades. Paula is currently chair of the Arab Theatre Studio and director of not-for-profit organisation, The Third Space. Paula has been a past peer for the Australia Council, participating on the Community Arts and Cultural Development panel.
Thank you, Lucy. I'm dialing in from the lands of the Wallamadigal, the Darug Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to First Nations people I'm sharing this panel with and who are watching this. I'm an Arab woman, daughter and granddaughter of immigrant settlers, and I have brown hair and brownish green eyes and olive skin, and wearing a black dress and glasses.
Thank you, Paula. And our final panellist is Travis de Vries. Travis is the producer and host of Bro Originals and the producer of Fear of a Black Planet. He's a concept artist and a gamer. Travis specialises in the delivery of culturally diverse projects and events across venues and artistic disciplines. He's also the founder and director of Awesome Black and an avid artist. Travis is an experienced assessor who has previously assessed for the Australia Council on the First Nations, multi-arts and dance panels.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Travis. I am a man in my 30s. I have light brown skin, no hair, blue eyes with glasses and a medium length beard, and I'm wearing a grey shirt.
Thank you, Travis. I'm now going to direct some questions to our panellists. The first question is for Trish. Trish, can you please give us an overview of the First Nations protocols? What are they and what do they cover?
Yeah, sure. So the First Nations protocols were published back in 2018. This is a third edition of the Australia Council protocols. The first edition was published in 2002 and was really brought to the Australia Council by the then Aboriginal Arts Board, who saw that there were a lot of issues out there in terms of people copying and ripping off Aboriginal stories and designs and art and performance. And because we don't have any particular laws in Australia that fully protect Indigenous art and culture and knowledge, the then board felt that there should be some sort of guidelines on how people should collaborate and work with First Nations artists and communities when they're wanting to use their cultural heritage and knowledge and content. And so back in 2018, we worked with Dr. Terri Janke and her company to revise the First Nations protocols, which are also available on the Australia Council website. And so the protocols are really best practice guidelines that sort of step you through 10 principles that allow people to have a better understanding of how you should respect and interact with First Nations communities and artists. And so Terri has developed these 10 principles in her True Tracks training that she does, but they're centered on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so that sort of international instrument gives Indigenous peoples all over the world specific rights to practice their culture in a safe way, to have self-determined practice as well. And so the principles really sort of speak to those rights that come from that instrument. And so the 10 principles are in the protocols, talk to respect, self-determination, communication, consultation and consent, interpretation, cultural integrity, authenticity, also secret and sacred knowledge, attribution, benefit sharing, continuing cultures, and recognition of protection. And so I always say probably the most important principles in the protocols talk to that issue around consultation and consent. So even before the thought of an idea of a project, if you are wanting to engage and collaborate with First Nations artists or communities, it's really important to first build up relationship with that community, and then you can start the consultation process with the sort of thought of an idea and see and make sure that the sort of elders or cultural custodians you're working with are really happy with the idea that you're going with. And then in terms of consultation, we always say it's an ongoing process, so it's not just a sort of tick a box process where you get sign off from the beginning. you have to constantly be going back and talking with the relevant elders or cultural custodians that you're working with to make sure that they're happy with how the project is going, where it's going to end up, who's going to see that work, how long is it going to be out sort of in the public, what's going to happen after the project is over. So it's real consultation from the start of the idea of the project right to the end of the project. And so that's a really important principle in the protocols. And the other one that's really important as well, they're all important principles, but the other one that's really important is around attribution and benefit sharing. So making sure that the particular communities or artists are credited for where that knowledge and culture is coming from. And if there is any commercialization or funding, for example, making sure that people are paid for their time and expertise and knowledge as either cultural advisors or artists in the projects. And so that's sort of like the first part of the protocols. And Terri and her team sort of worked through those principles and provide better understanding and good examples of how you sort of work through those 10 principles. And then the second part of the protocols talk about 14 different case studies. And so Terri and her team and myself interviewed a number of different artists and organisations across all the art forms that we fund at Australia Council. So visual arts, literature, theatre, dance, music, multi-arts projects, experimental and emerging arts, community arts, as well as events-based projects. And so I always say the case studies are the really fun part because they talk to, how you practically apply those 10 principles during a project. And so there are lots of different examples in there. One example is the Yiriakan project Hecata, when they translated a Shakespeare play Macbeth into Noongar language. And so that sort of example is in there about how they worked with community and were able to also develop the skills of sort of emerging actors who wanted to be part of this amazing Noongar language and cultural project. So that's an example in there. There's also the beautiful example Milky Way, where WA Ballet worked with Larrakia choreographer Gary Lang and the NT Dance Company, as well as Yolngu dancers from Arnhem Land. And so the sort of project there where they had to really engage with the local Whadjuk Noongar community to welcome Yolngu dancers and Gary onto Whadjuk Noongar country, so that there was proper sort of relationship building and cultural safety, having the Yolngu dancers on Noongar country. And so that's another really beautiful case study. They work through the 10 principles in the protocols. And so that's the next part of the protocols that I always recommend people have a read through. And then the last sort of part of the protocols, there's a really good checklist at the back of the protocols on page 168 that really step through those 10 principles, but in a really sort of practical way. So talking about, for example, do I need to get permission or consent? Does my project involve visiting an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community? Do I actually need to get permission for the local land council? In some remote communities, you need to get permission to actually visit particular Aboriginal lands, or if you're going to the Torres Strait, you need to get permission from either the Torres Strait councillor or council or trust to visit a particular island. If there are particular elements of secret or sacred knowledge, should you even be engaging in that material? That's really sort of probably not best to keep it out of the public eye, and only certain people in the community can see that knowledge. Are there traditional designs or stories or dances that need to be checked by the relevant cultural custodians? So there's all these kind of really good steps in the checklist that you can work through to make sure that you've sort of covered all your bases when working with First Nations artists and communities, and the protocols as well. And then just lastly, again, protocols are really best practice guidelines for people wanting to work with First Nations artists and communities. Relationship building is really the first step when wanting to work with First Nations communities. Consent, attribution, and benefit sharing are really important elements of the protocols to follow. An inclusive approach with your local First Nations community is really important in terms of any programming or projects you're working on. And also in terms of Australia Council funding, we do require that you have a read of the protocols and say that you abide by them, and then also show evidence in your application in terms of consent from elders by letters of support, and also consultation fees in the budget as well. But I think I will leave it there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Trish. That was excellent. Thank you. I'm now going to move to Travis. The next two questions are for him. The first question, Travis, an important topic that the assessment team discusses regularly is how non-Indigenous assessors can be good allies. This is in order for the panel to not solely rely on a First Nations assessor to do all the heavy lifting in relation to applicants adhering to First Nations protocols. Can you please give us some examples of how an assessor can use the protocols to be an ally at all stages of the assessment process?
Absolutely. I think kind of in terms of being a good ally, that's a really big question, and kind of how to be a good ally in this area. It's kind of tricky to define exactly how that is, and the sort of end goal outcome for that. I would say that, like, first off, really taking the time to read and understand the protocols is absolutely paramount for every assessor, and that you're fully up to date with exactly what the protocols are, and how they should be applied to grant submissions. During the assessment process, the protocols need to be applied equally to all submissions, and assessors should rely on advice from the Australia Council assessment team if anything is ever unclear. If there is a moment when you're at home assessing and you think this project does involve, or even potentially involves, Indigenous cultural intellectual property, and it hasn't been mentioned, then that's a good opportunity to flag that for discussion with the Australia Council team for discussion during the assessment meeting. And this is to ensure that funding is not given to projects that don't meet the criteria. It's everyone's responsibility to kind of look out for that. That said, I mean, in terms of being a good ally, I think if projects are coming from members of the First Nations community that don't clearly show an adherence to the protocols, then I firmly believe it's the assessors and the Australia Council Artist Services team responsibility to either ask for additional information earlier on, or mark the application as ineligible for funding, but that there is an opportunity for further advice to be given to the applicant. As Trish mentioned, the structure of the Australia Council applications clearly state at a moment that does your application involve First Nations cultural intellectual property as a box that you need to confirm either yes or no. And if you're ticking that yes, then you need to go through the requirements of these assessments. I think there is a real need for not just assessors, but also the wider industry and community to familiarize themselves with the protocols to a point where they have a really full understanding, and potentially even for individual organizations to create their own protocols policy based off the ICIP work that Terri Janke has done and Australia Council has available on the website. So to bring it all in. I think being a good ally in this case is about asking for additional information and relying on other OSCO staff that are there to guide you if there are questions. Don't necessarily ask the only First Nations person in the room, or if there's no First Nations person in the room, then take it upon yourself to ask those questions.
Thanks, Travis. And question 2 for you. Is there a difference in approach between applications coming from First Nations applicants and non-First Nations applicants?
I think this is, again, a tricky question, because I think in my experience as both an assessor and as a previous applicant, I think traditionally, yes, there has been a difference between the approaches from First Nations and non-Indigenous artists and organisations, and the assessment as well. And I think this is probably due to assumed knowledge about an application, but also just human error. Like, it is everyone's responsibility to kind of check and make sure that we are assessing to a high standard, but that occasionally things happen in the room and in the assessment process that is unavoidable. I think moving forward, we need to strive as assessors and Australia Council staff to really make sure we're applying the same metric and the same bar to application assessments, particularly with the required demonstration of ICIP. And and if that, like, kind of post-application, if something's not successful, that further education piece needs to happen.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. My next question is directed to Paula. Paula is no stranger to the process of consultation and consent in her work. Paula, what do you look for when determining if an artist or organisation has consulted appropriately?
Thank you. A really important question. I think that there's no closure on that question. I think I look for explicit actions and implicit signs that demonstrate, first and foremost, I think, a philosophy of practice that is grounded in ethical, respectful, and what I would consider a rights-based approach to engagement. And I think the principles in the protocols really underpin that rights-based approach. They embody it. So for me, a rights-based approach really enables people, especially First Nations people, to participate and influence decisions and outcomes that affect them. So when I see the word consultation, I think sometimes because of its history, I scrutinise that process, especially in the funding space and the arts space or any kind of community cultural context. The elements for me of a rights-based approach are really about participation and empowerment, and, as Trish said, cultural safety and accountability. And within the protocols, I think they're kind of the principles, the fundamental principles of an ethics of practice. As I said, for me, consultation as a method of engagement is quite low on the scale of a rights-based practice if we look at it through the critical lens of participation and power. I think consultation in and of itself is limited as a method because of its extractive history and the contemporary reality of who has the power to consult and set the terms of engagement with community. So quite often people participate by being consulted or by answering questions. External agents often in the organisation set that agenda, and I think Trish and Travis have covered that sense of the entirety. Why are we there? Why are we asking those questions? If external agents are framing the ideas, defining the knowledge capture processes and control the outcome, is there an obligation to even include the participants' views or ideas? So that's something I always look for. Without a critical approach, I think, to consultation, I always ask the question, are we contributing to the history of extractive colonialism, where we mine the stories and knowledge, the language and images from First Nation knowledge holders, elders and the communities. So I guess I look for evidence that the process of engagement is community-led or co-led or co-facilitated by artists or culture workers or members within the community who, as Tricia said, are paid for their expertise, knowledge and skill. I think I look for evidence of how the community is represented and whether they have a say in how the stories are framed and presented for the outside world. I think it's really important for organisations to especially articulate why they're working with First Nations communities and the nature of the partnership or relationship. I think this way, for all involved, we are clear about intentions and to be transparent about the purpose of the work and in whose interests the work is being created, produced, or indeed disseminated. In community cultural development, community arts and culture development practice, this is a critical consideration because we work with, by and for community. And so we must always be conscious of our purpose and actively committed, I think, to embodying an ethics of what I think is anxious care in our practice. I also want to mention, if an organisation has been working over a period of time with a community or is embedded in community, I look for signs here, especially that the process of engagement is led by community members who have been nurtured over time to be cultural leaders and the key creators in this space. I think it's a red flag for me that an organisation or an artist has worked with the community for years and retains the title of creative director or manager, and the community designated roles that have little or no power. So I want to see, I guess, explicitly how organisations have addressed cultural safety and what work they have to do to ensure that their organisational structures and systems and processes are not oppressive or harmful. And finally, I would say I want to see explicitly how the organisation resources community in the process of engagement in its entirety, how they maybe provide sustainable pathways towards creative and cultural autonomy, how they invest in building participants to lead, co-lead the creative process and co-manage the project so that into the future, the community does not need to be consulted because community members are the ones who initiate, direct and lead their own cultural vision. And in that way, the community self-mobilizes as a cultural force and are supported by organizations in partnership that are based on reciprocity. I think this model is really important because in that model, communities, the protocols are living and they're embodied, and the community members have agency, autonomy, and the resources to determine how they participate in the cultural life of community.
Thanks very much, Paula. That's fantastic. The next few questions are directed to Jake. As mentioned earlier, Jake talks to applicants on a daily basis. Jake, what do the Artist Services officers do in terms of application checks? What type of advice do you give to applicants about ensuring they reflect the protocols in their applications? And can you please give us an example of what happens if an applicant is working with First Nations people or content and has not addressed the protocols in their application?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lucy. So here in the Artist Services Department, we will go through every single application and do a scan. These scans are done before the assessment meetings that peers are in, and what we're looking for is any kind of contentious issues. So I'll just take you through that. We look at a lot of different things, but today we're talking about the First Nations protocols. So we go through at the top of an application. If there is a checkbox to tick, and it says, are you working with any First Nations artists and are you aware of the First Nations protocols? So that'll indicate to us that if a project is, and then we'll do some further checks. Things that we're looking at is to see if consultation has been exercised and consent has been given throughout the project. We will go through things like support material to see any kind of written evidence of this. We'll also look at the budget to check if there's been any remuneration for their time and for their consent, and also to check that everything has been credited and acknowledged properly. Now, if it hasn't, we will put it into a document called contentious issues, and we will alert the head of practice, which will be in these assessment meetings, of these particular applications. Then when the peers are in the meeting, that'll also be relayed. Also within these meetings, the peers and assessors are taking general feedback. As artist services officers, we sit in these meetings, we take that general feedback, and we will then, when speaking with applicants, always ensure to pass it on. So when the applicants reach out to us for advice from the First Nations protocols, firstly, we'll refer them to the protocols that Trish went through earlier, just so they have an understanding. The part that Trish was also referring to of the checklist, I think is really important. So we take them kind of through the checklist, where it's at, and to get familiar with it, to ensure that they're following the protocols, the right consultation and consent has been given, and also credit throughout the project. There'll be times where the applicant may have done this, but unless when going through the applications, we can see some of this support material or some of this information, there really is no way for us to tell that this has taken place. So we always, on the phone calls or any kind of emails, inquiries, as well as obviously telling them to follow the protocols, but to put that all in the application, put in all the written document of permission and consultation and consent, and also show where the people that they've been working with has been paid for their time and compensated correctly. So they're the ways that we check the applications, the advice that we give, and what happens if we flag a contentious issue with an application.
Thanks, Jake. And I've got one more question for you today.
Sure.
From your observations, does the First Nations panel approach the protocols any differently compared to the other art form panels?
From my personal observations, no. So I'm lucky enough that I'm usually in the First Nations panel, as well as the music and other art forms. Within all of these panels, it is relayed the importance of following the First Nations protocols, the peers to give the feedback to the applications, to ensure that any kind of contentious issues of people not following protocols has been checked. So from my personal opinion, experience is all panels, from what we relay here at Council in Artist Services and in the assessment team, understand the importance of following these protocols and can have healthy discussions within the meetings, as well as passing on the feedback of where they could have got maybe a little bit more consultation, or we don't feel like they've done enough. All that'll be taken down in the feedback, passed on to the applicants when they reach out to us. So after every round at Artist Services, we also give them general feedback. And across all art forms, ensuring that the First Nations protocols are adhered to is probably the first point.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. By way of closing this webinar, we've asked our panelists to prepare some final words of wisdom for using the First Nations protocols. I'm going to go to Trish, then Travis will speak, then Paula, and then Jake. So I'll start with you. Thank you, Trish.
Thanks, Lucy. I think the first step is really to have a look at the protocols. They are available on the Australia Council website. Have a read through the 10 principles. Have a look at the case studies as well, because they really bring to life those 10 principles and how you practically apply them. Have a look at the checklist as well on page 168 that provide that step-by-step process of how you do apply the protocols to your project or your work. I think also the first step is really, if you haven't engaged with your local Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community, have a chat with the elders in that community, maybe go to different events, different cultural events to sort of build up those relationships and awareness about how you do engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If you have any questions about the protocols, please feel free to reach out to us at Australia Council, either myself or the First Nations team or anyone in Artist Services as well. We're always here and happy to help. So good luck and thank you for watching us. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Trish. Over to you, Travis.
Thank you. I think it's important to sort of recognize that that every project is different, and these protocols are a bar for working on projects with First Nations communities using First Nations intellectual intellectual property, and so that when you need, as a project developer or an applicant, to ensure that you have an understanding of how, in this particular project, the protocols need to be applied, and that the community that you're working with understand that as well. For me, it all really comes down to relationship building and building one-on-one, and also building with the wider community. And I think around that sort of consensus conversation and around the protocols is that even though an individual is not the community, that you should never expect necessarily a full consensus when working with a First Nations community on projects that do involve cultural intellectual property. That, like any community meeting, not everyone is going to agree, but it's about ensuring that everyone is heard and understood and is kind of buys into the project in that way. Ethics of a society and a community aren't set in stone, and these conversations may change over time, and that may mean that the project that you want to do doesn't make sense to do now, and to have those mechanisms to know when to go, okay, well, this is okay, I won't put this project forward at this time.
Thanks, Travis. And I'll go to you, Paula. Thank you.
I agree. Relationship building and trust is really important. Building trust is a critical part of this conversation, because you open up a space for dialogue. And I think the dialogue is really important, and being aware, especially for us who are settlers, of our positions of power, really important. But mostly I want to acknowledge that the protocols are First Nations wisdom and knowledge, and they have been shared with us. And to honour that gift, I think we must embody and practice the protocols to their fullest potential.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'll go to you, Jake. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, look, I just want to echo a lot of what the others have said earlier. That's some really great points. I think from us as well, I really want to echo what Trish said is, if you do have any questions about your project, if you aren't sure or anything in the protocols are unclear, please reach out. That's what we're here for. That's what we do all day, and we love hearing from you. So if you have any questions, please do reach out. In terms of the protocols, again, the checklist is really handy to go through while you're doing your application, and also it's really important to, if you are working with any kind of First Nations arts or artists, get involved in the community, reach out to an elder and start that dialogue and relationship. But yeah, I guess most importantly from what we do in Artist Services is, if you have any questions, please do reach out and ask. We're here to help.
Thanks a lot, Jake. That's great. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. If you have questions about the protocols or the content of this webinar, we'd love to hear from you. Your questions help us learn more about using the protocols in context, as well as help us develop ideas for more resources. You can get in touch with us by email on assessment@australiacouncil.gov.au. A reminder, as our panellists have said too, the First Nations Protocols document is available on the Australia Council website. We will also be updating our frequently asked questions in due course following on from this webinar. A huge thank you to our panellists, Paula, Travis, Jake and Trish, all the way from Geneva, and to our interpreters, Alyssa and Isabella, and to my colleagues working behind the scenes for all their work setting up this webinar. And finally, a very humble thank you to all of you for watching. We're so pleased to have you working alongside us. I hope you stay safe and well. Goodbye.